Good afternoon, bonjour. My name is Michi Furuya Chang. I'm the Executive Vice President of Public Policy, Regulatory Affairs, and Head of Strategy at Food, Health and Consumer Products of Canada, FHCP for short. Just a little bit about where I come from. I'm, like Isabel, a registered dietitian, sort of cut my teeth in public health, in government, and then moved over to Sobeys, the retailer, for several years, and then worked for a global multinational, Kraft, for 15 years before now moving to the association. I think the common thread, though, throughout all of that is really making sure that from a food industry perspective, we are working towards good public policy and regulations here in Canada that can help the food and consumer product sector grow, innovate, and compete on the global stage. So for those of you that aren't familiar with FHCP, we are the national voice of the food, health, and consumer products manufacturing sector. We represent about 80% of all the products that you see on grocery store shelves, and really have enjoyed a collaborative relationship with government throughout. Again, in order to create those regulations that have the shared, the intended outcome of good public health outcomes, and not having any unintended negative outcomes. One of the reasons why we're coming here today, also FHCP has a division, and this is sort of in line with what Sylvain and Isabel just spoke about, but we do have a division. It's the Plant-Based Foods of Canada, and this is a sector that we are really looking to grow and help bring to Canada and bring Canada sort of onto the world stage. I think many of you here in the room may have plant-based food businesses that are looking to establish a market here in Canada, and that's something that we would like to support your efforts in doing so. So with that, I will like to introduce my guests, or our guests. To the right of me is Jay Holmes. He is the Director of Consumer Protection and Market Fairness at the Canadian Food Inspection Agency. To his right is Dr. Alfred Aziz. He's the Director at the Bureau of Nutritional Sciences at Health Canada. And then finally, to the far right of me is Dr. Chris Marinangeli. He is the Director of the Centre of Regulatory Research and Innovation at Protein Industries Canada. So maybe with that, I will, again, maybe go in sequence. If you could introduce yourselves, say a little bit about your role and your path here before we get into our questions. So over to you, Jay.
Thanks, Michi. Bonjour tout le monde. It's really great to be here. It's great to be out talking to people about labeling. It's funny that I have a long title. We were kind of joking about that before. But really what it boils down to for me and for us at the CFIA is we're responsible for food labeling and food quality rules in my division. And that part of it is, devising and enforcing the Safe Food for Canadians regulations. Another part of that is enforcing on behalf of my colleagues at Health Canada certain aspects of the food and drug regulations. And you see them really come together in some of these emerging issues and emerging labeling issues. And I know it's weird to call plant-based foods emerging. It's emerged, it's out there, it's in the marketplace. People are putting them on the market. So perhaps not an emerging issue, but it's something that it's a focus of ours. And it's a focus of ours in the sense that Michi mentioned at the beginning. It's about having good public policy to support it. And maybe I'll stop my remarks there, but it's great to be here to talk about this subject today.
Thanks, Jay, and bon après-midi tout le monde. Je m'appelle Alfred Aziz et comme Michi avait mentionné, je suis directeur du Bureau des sciences de la nutrition à Santé Canada. Vous pouvez poser la question dans la langue officielle de votre choix, mais je vais passer à l'anglais maintenant. In my role, I am really responsible for overseeing policies and regulations around nutritional quality of the food supply, as well as composition and labeling. So we also do pre-market assessment for foods that are brought into market where there is a need to do a pre-market assessment, and we do research as well. And it's interesting that this is kind of a little bit of outside on a tangent. We heard previously that the two presenters, Sylvain and Isabelle, talking about the food guide. This was my previous role before I took that one. And so I'm very happy to hear the positive impact that the food guide has had over the last 5 years since it was launched on eating habits of Canadians, and we hope that it will continue to do so. And that the presentation after is about front of package labeling, which was really the policy that kind of I led a few years ago before I moved to my job on the food guide. But now I'm talking about something that I'm the least familiar with because I'm new in my job. So that will be an interesting discussion this afternoon. So bear with me about if I'm a little bit stumbling, and forgive me. But over to you.
Thanks, Alfred. Chris Marinangeli, I'm the director of the Centre for Regulatory Research and Innovation at Protein Industries Canada. For those of you who don't know, Protein Industries Canada is one of Canada's global innovation clusters funded by the ISED, the federal government, with the focus to really grow the plant-based food industry within Canada, creating an opportunity for Canada domestically and internationally. In terms of a background, I have a PhD in clinical nutrition. I cut my teeth at Kellogg Canada, worked across the ag sector before landing at PIC. I'll leave it at that. Thank you.
Excellent. Thank you so much. Maybe for those, I think most of the room would understand, but maybe could I also turn it over to Alfred and Jay, really just to speak about the role of Health Canada versus the role of the Canadian Food Inspection Agency. They're both government bodies, but maybe just for the audience to level set and clarify.
Maybe I can start? Okay. So Health Canada is the federal department responsible for maintaining and improving the health of Canadians. From the perspective of food and nutrition, the mandate is to really, and responsibilities are to assess the health risks and benefits associated with food, to set policies, regulations, and standards with respect to the nutritional quality of the food supply, as well as composition and labeling, but also to provide advice and information on healthy eating and food safety. So this is like in a very high level, the role of Health Canada in the space of food and nutrition. And maybe turn it over to Jay to kind of say what the role of CFIA is.
It's very complimentary. I would say that I joke sometimes. I say, I work for Alfred, or the inspectors work for Health Canada. There's a big element of that. So what the CFIA does, the CFIA has its inspectors across the country that are out there verifying compliance with regulations and with requirements. Some of them are regulations that belong to and are set by Health Canada with respect to nutritional labeling, allergens, things of that nature. And then there is another set of regulations that the CFIA owns itself, which are under the Safe Food for Canadians regulations, which have the requirements for net quantity. There are some compositional standards under that as well. And a lot of that sort of mandatory labeling information that you see on the front of the package. And it's interesting, and it's worth, I think, dwelling on for a moment. I say we're out there enforcing. And I don't want to give the impression that the CFIA is out there necessarily all the time being the food police and trying to catch, a business doing something incorrectly, or doing something that's at odds with the regulations. What our goal is at the end of the day for the CFIA is that everybody who is out there who is in business is complying. And a lot of our effort, and I think the biggest bang for our buck at the CFIA is really helping to promote that compliance. And so while we have the inspectors with their badges and they're going out and doing inspections and doing all this sort of thing, we do put a lot of effort into providing guidance for industry as well. So we have something called the Industry Labeling Tool, which is on the CFIA's website, which goes through for labeling every single requirement that exists in the food and drug regulations, that exists in the Safe Food for Canadians regulations, so industry can see, well, okay, here's when you translate all this very legal text into something that looks like, what am I supposed to do to label my food? You can go there and look at that. The nice thing about that as well is that that's the same or one of the tools that the inspector will use also. So if you're ever in doubt, you can say to an inspector, well, I read the ILT or the labeling tool, it said to do this, I did it, and then that should be the end of the conversation, hopefully. We also have tools like Ask CFIA, Sometimes I say ask CFIA, and then I have a bunch of people looking daggers at me, but I don't see that today. But it's a service that we offer as well. Sometimes it can take a while to answer a question, but that's a service that people can access when they have a question about how do I comply with the regulations. You can say, I've read the ILT, my situation doesn't seem to fit into this, CFIA, can you help me? You can also have a conversation with a local inspector. That's another place where people often go to get that help to comply. So I don't want to give the impression that we're just out there trying to catch people making mistakes or going against the regulations, but there's a lot of back and forth to be had with the CFIA, especially when we get into this new class. Again, I'm calling them new, but when we get into the plant-based as well.
Excellent. Thank you so much. In terms of some of the most recent and most relevant initiatives that Health Canada and CFIA has undertaken in the plant protein space, can you speak a little bit about those two areas?
Yes, certainly. So we heard in the previous session talking about the food guide, and so this is one of the earliest things that we've done around the plant-based in the plant-based stage. As you probably know, the food guide recommends eating a variety of nutritious foods every day that includes fruits and vegetables, whole grains and proteins, and among proteins, consume plant-based protein more often. I still remember exactly what the food guide says. That's very good. So, but also the food guide does recommend limiting highly processed food that contribute to excess sodium saturated fat and free sugars. So there is like and when we talked earlier about the food guide, and it was and one of the findings was that perhaps there were these like highly processed plant-based proteins that went down in terms of consumption, but people are now more open to the types of plant-based protein like the way they are. That's good news for the food guide, because this is exactly what we're trying to drive Canadians toward. Beyond the food guide, there's also been some work that has been done. When we published the final regulations for front-of-package labeling in 2022, we also did something within the regs that we took the what we call the framework for claims, or the table about nutrient content claims, out of the regulations into what we call in the regulatory language incorporated by reference document. And you'll hear me talk about that a little bit earlier. That is still part of the regulations, that has still the force of the law, but what it does is that makes things easier to change when there is evolution in the science, when there is evolution in innovation, et cetera. So in that space, the protein claims, source of protein, excellent source of protein, et cetera, are part of that table. So if you want to make changes in the future to allow more plant-based protein to have some claims, it will be much easier to do rather than have to go to Canada Gazette and make a huge process to make those kind of changes. So this is another change that we've done in terms of the plant-based protein. And more recently, we currently finished consultation on modernizing the Part B of the Food and Drug Regulations. And part of that is also to allow more flexibility and more innovation to come into that space. And from that angle, some of the work around plant-based protein include taking the protein quality measurements out of the regulations and putting it into an incorporated by reference document, and adding a new methods to be able to assess protein quality. So all of these things are steps in the right direction. We haven't yet finalized these regulations, but they are going to come very soon, hopefully. So that's from Health Canada side of things, and maybe I'll turn to Jay now to say what's been done on the CFIA side.
On the CFI side, and this sort of ties into what I mentioned earlier, our focus for the last, I would say, 2 or 3 years has been really on building out our guidance that we have available to people who are selling these products in the marketplace. So what you would have seen, I'd say 2 or 3 years ago, and culminating in October, was some work that led to updating our guidance for simulated meat and poultry. So that was a situation where, these regulations came into being 15, 20, 25 years ago, when the marketplace was very different, governing these products. And what the CFIA had in its industry labeling tool was, I would say, very limited and was more in line with the products that were in the marketplace when the regulations were introduced, and not in line with what you see in the marketplace today, just in terms of the variety and all the different sort of ways people are positioning simulated meat and poultry in the market. So we went through a process of a consultation to say, you know what, really, what do we need to clarify? What do we need to expand on in this guidance to help people figure out, okay, I want to position this as simulated meat and poultry product, great. Here are the rules I need to follow. Here are the steps I need to do. If I want to be in that other category where I am just a chickpea patty, how do I position that product? So we went through a lot of work to really clarify and build out the guidance to say if you're going to position as simulated meat and poultry, follow these rules. If you want to stay in that sort of other, more undefined, unstandardized food category, this is what you need to do, and this is how you don't accidentally put yourself in the simulated meat and poultry category where you have to do all the fortification, things like that. So that was sort of a large amount of work we did. Like I said, it culminated in October. We published some new guidance. What we've turned our attention to now is more of that sort of broader category of plant-based foods, and we're hoping to launch a consultation on that in the months ahead that looks at some subset of products, whether it's the sort of the cheeses or eggs. We're sort of figuring out what the scope is going to be, but the next step for us is to really do a consultation that goes beyond simulated meat and poultry. I'm sorry, that pun was not intended. But takes us into more of the sort of wider variety of products out there that gives people a little more guidance on how to label things, with respect to the terminology they use, the images they use, the packaging they use, very similar thinking to what you would have seen us do in simulated meat and poultry. So our focus now is what it was before. It's giving people the guidance they need to label these products.
Excellent. Thank you so much. Very helpful. Maybe I'll turn it over to Chris, and this is really a question for everyone, but maybe Chris, you could start there. Certainly at Protein Industries Canada and the Centre for Research Innovation that you lead. From a regulatory or policy perspective, what do you see as some of the irritants or barriers to the plant-based foods space here in Canada?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think Jay touched on it a little bit. And just if you take a step back, the plant-based sector is really a hub of innovation. This stems from global discussions around the interplay between diet, environmental sustainability, which has driven a lot of investment in the space. A lot of innovation has happened very quickly. CPG's investing, capital firms are investing, even governments investing with ISET in Canada on growing the space. And that's, I would say, it's easy to point a finger at my colleagues in the government, but it's tough for policies and regulations to move at the pace and innovation, considering how fast the space is changing. To make things even more complicated, when we talk about the food innovation in the plant-based space, there are a number of different departments to which there are regulatory touch points. Of course, there's a CFIA, there's Health Canada, there's also ISED with investment. There could be Environment and Climate Change Canada, even the Competition Bureau. So there's a lot of touch points along the way with innovation moving at the pace it is. And I would say the most complicated file is Health Canada. The files with touch points in the government would be Health Canada, the CFIA. Not to point a finger, but when your jurisdiction is around health of Canadians, safety and due diligence become paramount when you have the backs of 40 million people that you have to think about. That being said, with all that in mind, some irritants that do come to mind, now I'm pointing a finger a little bit, I guess, would be labeling, how we position protein foods, and Alfred touched on it a little bit, how there's going to be some changes coming down the pipe in terms of how we are able to position protein foods to Canadians and claim that they are a source of protein. There's, I think we all talk about it when we're in the same room. I think everyone would like to see more collaboration between other jurisdictions, particularly perhaps around novel foods. Novel foods is a bottleneck for innovation, considering the timelines. Fortification can be a challenge, but the changing food landscape, for example, there are questions that arise regarding whether our fortification regulations are keeping pace with what is required in the marketplace and what the offerings are to Canadians. And I even say, and I think Jay's touched on a little bit, how we are able to talk about these foods. So leveraging the regulations or using the regulations, what is the common name? How can we talk about these foods? When is this food have a standard of identity? When does it not have a standard of identity? And I think there are things that are moving, but I would say it's probably of no surprise that those are the irritants, in my opinion. Low-hanging fruit, guys. So.
I guess I would ask from Health Canada and CFIA's perspective.
He's going to say everything that I said, right?
I'm gonna say
I'm laughing.
depends on who you say low-hanging fruits. No, I understand that there is like some currently, like in the Food and Drug Regulation, some really strong inflexibilities. Jay mentioned that these regulations have been in place for probably maybe my age or even older. Really? Okay. So, but at the same time, I think that we mentioned earlier that we are taking some modernization action. So through the Treasury Board Secretariat, Agriculture and Aquaculture Roadmap, we have undertaken some modernization projects. There was some focus originally, and so we've done those consultations. We're making things more flexible. Not necessarily that the changes have happened at this stage, but we're setting the stage for the changes to happen more efficiently. And so we talked, like Chris mentioned, protein quality and how this is going to be impacting protein claims, protein content claims. So this will be something that, once the regulations are finalized and the table is put into the IBR document, then this is going to be something that we can address more efficiently and more easily to enable innovation. There are other still very hardwired things in the regs that I think would require more work. Like, for example, fortification provisions, they are scattered throughout the regulations, Part B and Part D. But, Jay mentioned earlier that there are potentially some work around these. So if you're not, for example, positioning your food as a simulated meat product or poultry product, so if it's not a standardized food, then it doesn't have to kind of like be compliant with fortification provisions. So there are ways around it, and until we kind of do more work in terms of modernizing the food regulations, I think that we're making excellent progress on that step, but acknowledging that there is more work to do.
And I would say, too, it's nice when you agree on the solution, because that's the one thing that I take away from all this. And like I said, the focus of the CFI isn't necessarily on changing our regulations. The regulations that we need, or the regulations that we rely on for food labeling from the CFI's perspective, I'm not talking about necessarily the fortification sort of angle of things, but when it comes to those labeling questions, we have the regulations we need. We have compositional standards that exist sort of over here for specific products. We also have regulations that say, you can trade in these things, provided that they're not going to be or not likely to be mistaken for the standardized product. So we do have a regime that exists, but right now it's really a challenge, or it's the task for the CFI to explain how these pieces fit together and how you can fit them together when you're coming up with a label for your product. And so that's why I come back to, for us, the challenge is, getting some guidance out on the road that explains to people, here's how you stay on the safe side of the law. So from the CFI's perspective, it's less about changing regulations as opposed to just explaining what's there, which for us is a good position to be in. It's a little quicker process than reg change.
Thank you. Maybe I could push back on that just a little bit now from an industry perspective. It's really hard to innovate, grow, compete within the confines of what I think we see in Canada is very prescriptive, very restrictive regulations when you compare us to any other jurisdiction in the world. Of course, we have one of the safest food systems in the world, which is wonderful. But without a change in the regulations, it's hard to innovate. And as such, I guess the next question would be, what does government need in terms of information and data? What is it that we can bring forward to, I guess, prioritize regulatory modernization in this space, and eventually changing the regulations?
I guess that's a question for me. So obviously, like any other regulations that we have, it needs to be evidence-based and evidence-informed. And we know that there is a big shift in the market. We're seeing that. We see that the consumer demands are changing. We see also that industry is responding to consumer demands. But we need to be able to, when we put regulations, and to go back to the mandate of Health Canada is primarily to maintain and improve the safety and health of Canadians. So we want to make sure that the regulations that when we support, if they are going to support innovation, that they're not going to be unintended consequences on health and safety. And also when we put health and safety regulations, that they're not putting undue burden on industry. So it's an act of balance at the end of the day when we do regulations. From that angle, what I would say is that the evidence that we need in that space is what are the consumers eating? How do they perceive those types of food? Let's talk, for example, about plant-based foods. What is the perception of plant-based protein? What are their attitudes? How do they actually understand? How do they use them? Do they use them as substitutes for meat, and etc.? And if they do, what are some of the impacts of the consumption of these types of products on their health? Are they going to have some impact on nutritional risks, like deficiencies or not? And how does that impact their overall eating pattern? So these types of evidence would support us in better understanding what kind of regulations would be kind of strike that balance that I was saying, to make sure that we're not going to have any negative impact on the health and safety on Canadians, at the same time allowing the innovation to proceed forward. And I know that FHCP has done some work in that space where they look at consumer and their attitudes and perceptions about these foods. We'll continue to look. It's evolving. We will also need to continue to look at how we can assess the impact on Canadian eating patterns. You're maybe familiar that the last survey that we conducted around Canadian eating habits were from 2015. There is not one in the horizon yet, but we are hoping that we can also leverage the research that is out there to help us gain more information on where these vulnerabilities are and if there is any impact, and maybe we can use these types of data to help inform our regulations as well.
Thank you for that. And maybe that's a perfect segue then into Chris and the research that you're doing to support innovation at Protein Industries Canada. Can you speak to some of the initiatives that you're working on right now that would sort of support that prioritization of regulatory modernization?
Yeah, absolutely. So the Center for Regulatory Research and Innovation really has a great opportunity here. At Protein Industries Canada, there are two streams of work. There's the technology stream, and there's the capacity building stream. Technology stream really formulates consortiums around food industry stakeholders to generate IP and the commercialization of innovation in the space. On the capacity building side, my work is really around creating an enabling environment and answering those questions that Alfred might look to fill those gaps and make regulatory changes that I ask for. Just kidding. We do a number of things. So we engage with our members. So we answer a lot of regulatory questions, provide regulatory guidance. We engage with the government on consultations. We collaborate with other stakeholders on government, on consultations and initiatives that they're undertaking. But I think where the rubber hits the road is we're investing significantly in research to address those regulatory bottlenecks. So we are conducting clinical trials at universities in Canada looking at cardiometabolic outcomes when consumers are consuming diets that comprise innovative plant-based foods. We're looking at consumption patterns of innovative plant-based foods with families and children to look at biochemical outcomes and strategies to incorporate these foods in the diets, looking at health outcomes. We're modeling the effects of fortification laws on dietary intakes and nutrient density, protein quality of diets. We've just wrapped up a study that looked at applying various labeling schemes from other jurisdictions around the world on protein labeling for source of protein claims, applying to our national survey data to look at not only what happens to the protein intake and the nutrient density of diets, but what happens to the protein quality. And I think with the protein play, that's one of the bigger questions, because when we're consuming a lot of animal protein, protein quality is an issue, but looking at protein quality on a population level, when we start to integrate these foods that might have a lower protein quality, what happens to those dietary patterns? Yeah, so those are some of the things that we're working on. Some of this stuff is being written up right now and being submitted for peer review. And I will say, in Canada, to give a plug to my colleagues, if you call Health Canada and CFIA, they will call you back. It actually is a pretty good system in the sense that if you're looking for guidance, and I would encourage you to engage. It's not going to flag you in some way that they're going to keep an eye on you. I think they'd prefer it that way. And all of the work that we're participating in and the research outcomes that we're looking at the center, people that report to you, Alfred, know about it. You know, because you're new in the job. So I just want you to know that your team knows that it's happening. So, and I would, with this work, it's very important to keep the government engaged and let them know that it's coming. So you're sort of working, if you're looking for a reg change and generating the data, you're keeping them abreast of the information along the way. You're undertaking that journey together.
Yeah. Appreciate that.
No
Yes.
problem. Should we fist bump?
And
Maybe I
to
just want to
yes,
add
go ahead.
like one thing about also evidence is we also look at what other regulators across the world are doing. And so where industry is going, where government is going is very important to see. Like we don't operate in a vacuum. So we're aware that there are some regulators that are putting on more regulations. Some regulators are looking at putting on flexible rules and regulations. So this is the space that this is our what I call our regulatory sandbox as well. Like what can we do to make sure that we're paying attention to the health and safety, but we're also kind of paying attention to what's happening in the marketplace and not creating bottlenecks, and all of these flexibilities and tools that we have in our disposal to make those kind of regulations more flexible and nimble is something that we're really kind of paying too much attention to at this time. Yeah.
Thank you. I will just also echo and build on Chris's plug for our government colleagues. Although it may seem like it's an industry and data versus the government, it really is a collaborative effort. We really do enjoy a good partnership with government, and it really is because we do have the same objective in terms of public health outcomes that make sense for Canadians. So I do want to thank all three of you, Chris, Alfred, Jay, for being with me today. And please, thank you for joining us. And if there's anything, please don't hesitate to reach out to any one of us. Thank you so much.